Hello everyone. This presentation would focus on Homer, who is one of the foremost among the Greek classical writers. Homer, the Greek poet, is believed to have been born around 750 BC. He lived in the 8th century BC, but we have very little reliable information about him. There are several references in his poems which suggest that he had knowledge of the Eastern Aegean, and ancient testimony puts his home in Ionia, the Greek islands and cities on the coast of modern Turkey. At least 7 different places claim that Homer was born on their soil in the ancient world. The two with the strongest claims are the island of Chios and the city of Smyrna, which is in modern-day Turkey. The consensus of opinion is that Homer might have probably lived and worked in Ionia. And Ionia is a region along what is now the west coast of Turkey. According to a hymn which was written in honor of the god Apollo, he was blind. He was a blind man from the island of Chios, and Chios is in eastern Mediterranean. Chios was home to a guild of poets, or the so-called rhapsodists, and they were called as Homeridae, and seemed to be one of the most likely candidates. Actually, Homer is believed to be commonly used as a general term to refer to all the blind men who used to wander in the countryside reciting epic poetry. So, everything else that's repeated about Homer, for example, the stories that he was blind, all that is a result of a fanciful conjecture. A continuing scholarly question, which is very frequently referred to as the Homeric question, focuses on whether an actual person named Homer, did he ever exist? Or has he ever composed all these poems? Or is Homer just a fiction? The poems actually might be a compilation from the oral epic tradition which was put together by several editors together. So, but as author of the two most important literary works from Greece, that is the Iliad and Odyssey, his importance to Greek culture cannot be underestimated. So, Homer's verses were first set down in writing around 700 BC. And it was also around the 700 BC that it was soon after that the Greeks invented their own alphabet by incorporating vowels into the existing Phoenician alphabet. And these verses of Homer, it is definitely older than this, because we know that until this point they had been memorized by the so-called traveling minstrels or the bards, who earned a living by reciting them. Now let's look into what are the important contributions that Homer has made to Greek culture or literature. His most important contribution is that he has provided a common set of values that enshrined the Greeks' ideas about themselves. And when you look into his poems, we can find that they provide a fixed model of heroism, nobility, and a good life to which all Greeks, especially the aristocrats, subscribed to. In his works, a disgrace due to dishonor is the worst that can happen to a hero, and a short life of glorious deeds is considered far superior to a long life of peace and mediocrity, since by great deeds a man might become immortal. And the way that Homer has portrayed gods is also interesting, since in many ways they are used for comic relief, possessing far less dignity than their heroic mortal counterparts. And the ancient Greeks have attributed the great epic poems of Iliad and the Odyssey to Homer. The text of Iliad and Odyssey were not written down upon creation, and there are modern scholars who generally agree that he composed, but probably he was not the person who actually wrote it. The Iliad, most likely, it relies upon oral traditions which was already there in existence, and it has also inspired the composition of the Odyssey, which is a sequel to the Iliad. So these two epics, they provide the basis of Greek education and culture in the classical age. And they have also remained for a long time as the most significant poems of the European tradition. The earliest surviving literature of the West can be found in these two epics, which have been attributed to Homer, that is the Iliad and the Odyssey. The Iliad and the Odyssey, they've been written in dactylic hexameter. Or there are several questions like how old the oral epic tradition was by the time Homer composed his poems, or whether Homer himself knew how to write or dictated to a scribe, or how much of his epics is traditional, or how much is he invented by himself. All these are fascinating questions, but impossible to answer to. The subject matter of the Epic of Homer, it comprises of the adventures, values, and experiences of aristocratic warriors who lived in a world frequented by the gods. And we find there is constant interaction between gods and the human beings. Homer's epics are also concerned with the period mentioned as the Trojan War and the aftermath of the Trojan War. That is, the heroes return home from the war. The time period could roughly be from the 12th century BC. And to support this, we have evidence from archaeology because in the modern era, the archaeological discoveries have confirmed that once there existed a civilization which was called as Mycenaean. And we have got its ruins from Mycenae in central Greece. And this civilization in many respects, it resembles, particularly in its material culture, it resembles the world which was described by Homer. But thematically, Homer's epics reflect the period of 9th to the 8th century BC, and that was the period when the power of aristocratic clans was beginning to be challenged by the rise of city-states and the consensual governments. Now we're going to look in detail about the theme of Homer's epic, the first one, Iliad. The Iliad was set during the Trojan War, and it tells the story of the wrath of Achilles. The Iliad is an ancient Greek epic poem which is traditionally attributed to Homer. It's set during the Trojan War, and the Trojan War was a 10-year siege of the city of Troy, which is also called as Ilium, by a coalition of Greek states. And it tells of the battles and events during the weeks of a quarrel that took place between King Agamemnon and the warrior Achilles. So this story, it covers a few weeks in the final year of the war. The Iliad mentions or alludes to so much of the Greek legends about the siege, the earlier events such as the gathering of warriors for the siege, the cause of the war, the related concerns tend to appear near the beginning. And then the epic narrative, it even takes up events prophesied for the future, such as Achilles' looming death, the sack of Troy, or prefigured and eluded more and more vividly, so that by the time it reaches an end, this poem, it has told a more or less complete tale of the Trojan War. The Iliad is among the oldest extant works of Western literature, and its written version is usually dated to around the 8th century BC. If you look into the modern Vulgate, the accepted version we have at present, the Iliad contains about 15,693 lines, and it's written in a language of Homeric Greek. Homeric Greek is a literary amalgam of Ionic Greek and several other dialects. So the Iliad, which is the longer as well as the earlier of the two Homeric epics, it covers a few weeks in the 10th year of the fighting at Troy. It focuses on the character of Achilles, as I've already told, and Achilles becomes enraged after a quarrel with Agamemnon. Agamemnon is the leader of the Greek expedition. Agamemnon is the brother of Menelaus as well. We know Menelaus, his wife Helen, who ran off with the Trojan prince Paris. And that was the reason which started off this war. So Homer, he traces the effects of Achilles' wrath, which include the death of his best friend Patroclus, the Trojan champion Hector, whose death at Achilles' hands signals the fall of Troy. So, in the course of telling the story, Homer very brilliantly he reveals the destructive effects of the aristocratic hero's code of honor and vengeance. And in the end, we find how the community is being sacrificed for the hero's personal quest for his glory. So, Homer shows us that a political community cannot exactly exist when ideals are based on personal honor, achieved through violence, that our humanity depends on the ties that bind or our obligations to other humans, obligations that the hero, by contrast, will have to sacrifice to achieve glory. So that is what we have about the Iliad. Now moving on to his next second epic, the Odyssey, which is the second major ancient Greek epic poem that's been attributed to Homer. What does the Odyssey deal with? It tells the story of the hero Odysseus' adventures on his return home after the fall of Troy. And this is a more accessible story than the Iliad. It's filled with fabulous locales, seductive temptresses, fearsome monsters, a lot of detail. But the Odyssey also movingly details the effects on the home front of a warrior's prolonged absence. That is, it's a sequel to the Iliad. The poem is fundamental to the modern Western canon, and it's the second oldest extant work of Western literature. The Iliad is the oldest. Now, it's believed to have been composed near the end of 18th century BC, 8th century BC. That is somewhere in Ionia. Ionia, as I've mentioned it is in the Greek coastal region of Anatolia. The poem mainly centers on the Greek hero Odysseus. Now, Odysseus in Roman myths, he's known as Ulysses. So, the journey of Odysseus, the journey that he takes home after the fall of Troy. So, and it takes Odysseus an amazing 10 years to reach Ithaca after the 10-year Trojan War. So, in his absence, it's assumed that he has died, and his wife Penelope and his son Telemachus, they must deal with a group of unruly suitors. And these suitors, they compete for Penelope's hand in marriage. And Odysseus, it continues to be read in the Homeric Greek, but it has been translated into modern languages around the world. Many scholars, they believe that this original poem was composed in oral tradition by a sort of an epic poet or a minstrel, perhaps like a rhapsody. Rhapsody is like a professional performer and was more likely intended to be heard. It was orally spread across generations rather than being read. So, the details of the ancient oral performance and the story's conversion later on to a written work inspire a lot of discussion and debate among scholars. The Odyssey was written in a poetic dialect of Greek, and that is a literary amalgam of Aeolic Greek, Ionic Greek, and several other ancient Greek dialects. It has got 12,110 lines written in dactylic hexameter, and the most noteworthy elements of this epic poem are firstly, its plot that is non-linear, and it shows how choices made by women and serfs can influence events, and it also describes the heroic deeds of the fighting men. So, in English language as well as many others, the word Odyssey, that very thing it has come to refer to an epic voyage. So Odyssey, if you look into the character of Odysseus, he is a much more attractive character than the brooding, egocentric, idealist Achilles. Because firstly, Odysseus is older. He's already got a wife, he's got a son, and he displays a sort of practical realism and an acceptance of those tragic limitations of life against which Achilles chafes. And besides the wily Odysseus, the Odyssey contains several remarkable female characters as well. Particularly, we have the wife of Odysseus, Penelope. Penelope's tricky ways, which are almost the equal of her husband's. So, the marriage of Penelope and Odysseus, based on similarities of character, virtues, and values, it demonstrates the central role that social institutions play in crafting human identity and a stable social order, making it possible. So, the natural world is presented as a harsh, sort of a dangerous place, but still where human beings can flourish because they have minds like Odysseus that can think up various contrivances that allow life to be successfully navigated. So, it's sort of an inspiring story of the success of mankind. And also because they live in communities where there are shared values, institutions, codes, all these things lessen the destructive effects of nature's forces and are equally destructive appetites and passion as well. And finally, to bring in a conclusion where we find that in both the epics of Homer, he describes in impressive depth a range of human behavior, human nature, motivation. So he recognizes the contradictions and complexities which are there in the human soul, as well as the tragic limitations of human existence. So, as a very striking concluding remark, we could say that Homer is a fabulous storyteller that the world has ever seen. His diction, simile, imagery, of which is very precise and vivid description of action, the economy of the narrative style, all these are still fresh and entertaining, even after so many years, almost 2,700 years, but still he remains fresh. So, among the Greeks, Homer's literary and cultural authority is similar to that of the cultural literary authority that Shakespeare holds among the English speaking people. So, we could say that Homer was, after all, he was a master and it's impossible to imitate. So, that is what we've seen about Homer. We've seen his biography, the two major Homeric epics, and their general themes. And so that's it about Homer.